Hi, this is Diane Hennessy King, and welcome to On the Go with AAUW. We have a fantastic program today. It is about storytelling, and it's not the once upon a time. It is storytelling for a social cause, for building bridges instead of walls. And today we have Kristin Pedemonti, and she has written 3 books on storytelling, but more importantly, you have gone around the world practicing your storytelling and bringing people together and expressing a variety of cultures, a variety of goals. And I know that in 2005, you chucked it all, sold everything, and went to Belize for a literacy project. Mm-hmm. But even before that, and the cover behind us is the book that she wrote about that trip and that literacy project. But before that, you became so enthused with the power of story, right? Mm-hmm. And you want to tell us how that happened?
Sure. I was working as a research interviewer on an ovarian cancer study at the University of Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. And it was quite a broad study. We interviewed 1,500 women in 15 counties, Pennsylvania, parts of New Jersey, Delaware, and it was a really intensive questionnaire. It was 64 pages. But the most telling part was the most valuable question ended up being the only really open one, which was tell the story of how you were diagnosed. And from that one question, they were able to glean all this information that many of these women had been walking around for years, sometimes decades, knowing something was amiss in their system. But because the symptoms are related to so many other things, they weren't being properly diagnosed. They weren't being properly listened to. So if you fast forward to present day, there are several medical schools that now have storytelling as a required course for the medical students to take. And for me, back in the mid-90s when I was working on that study, it planted a seed in my mind about the power of story in that aspect, and one that I hadn't necessarily considered before.
And because you think of a medical situation as being strictly fact-driven and not the incredible power of being listened to, because storytelling involves somebody listening to your story as well, and enacting something on it. So the Bridge of Stories, when you finished the cancer project, you decided to go to Belize and start this literacy project. Can you tell us a little bit about it? And
Sure.
I mean, it's just a tremendous effort that you put in.
Thank you. And it was upon invitation, so it wasn't an idea that came into my mind on my own. I was invited by Naftali Lemos, who is, at that time, a young Belizean, a snorkel guide. And we were talking about me being a storyteller and the work I was doing already in the U.S. with folk tales. And he was really intrigued by that and explained that in his country, their literacy rate had dropped by something like 40% in only 15 years' time. Wow. And it was a perfect storm that happened. Television had just come in. The Northern Highway was built, so people had greater access to Belize City, and many people were leaving the villages to go to the city to find work. So the extended family wasn't there like it had been before in sharing things like reading aloud or taking the children to the local village library. That fell to the wayside, and then TV became the hobby. It became the thing to do. So as this perfect storm happened, and then there were other challenges with curriculum. That was a really big one, where in primary school, the curriculum didn't necessarily support the students enough to be able to go on to secondary school. And it was a lot of memorization by rote and call and response. So all of these things culminated into Naftali saying, hey, I think you've got this great enthusiasm for story. At the time, I was working in a small library in semi-rural Pennsylvania, connecting kids with books there. And I talked to him about that. I said, come to Belize and do that. So when the project started, it was a lot more about, you mentioned listening, and that's so important. It was listening to teachers and principals and administrators about what were the challenges they were facing. And then I would share, well, my skill set is I'm pretty good at building enthusiasm between kids and books and story, and I'd love to do some teacher training. And they asked for books, for actual materials. So it started with book drives that were really targeted, specific titles that were requested, and then teacher training, not just on sharing the books aloud, but how could you use this in the curriculum? How could you adapt to science and history and really utilize the books in many ways? And then after that, that was for about maybe 6 or 8 months that the project was in that format. And then as I was traveling to all these different villages, I started hearing these indigenous stories that were fascinating. And it really drew me in, and realized that when I was in the schools, I wasn't hearing these stories being used. I was hearing a lot of material from other countries being used, whether that was the US or the UK or the Caribbean, but it wasn't their own stories. And so again, with conversations and listening, finally mentioned to the teachers, wouldn't it be great to utilize your own cultural stories to teach creative writing? Because that was another gap in their curriculum that they had identified to me. And so developed, mostly me developing, but certainly with their input, this guided creative writing where the students would discuss several of these legendary characters from their own cultures, and then choose one to meet face to face. And what would happen if they met that character face to face? And for the students to see, first of all, their culture in the story that they were writing, and second, that they were in the story. They really engaged and connected to the material. And
so
teachers,
you really moved the oral storytelling into print in a way. Yeah.
Exactly, because they really needed that experience. They needed the experience of, they had barely any writing experience that was beyond, you mentioned just the facts, you know, in medicine, well, in school often it's just the facts, right? So this was a way that they could be creative, and they could also work on their grammar and strong word choice and descriptive writing, and all the while they are in the story.
And what made you decide to write the book about it?
Yes, so that came about from really sort of 3 different thoughts of selling the house and the stuff to do the project. A lot of people would say, oh, you know, oh, that's so special that you did that. And I would say, okay, well, maybe it was kind of a crazy choice, sure, but anybody can do this. I had no background in how to start a creative volunteer project. I learned it all by doing. And so part of the book is the journey of not knowing what I was doing, and sometimes that was a blessing, and how other people could maybe make that choice, even if they didn't know exactly what they were doing. And the second part was wanting to share the creative writing process and the guided lesson plan with other teachers and educators, so that they could take that and adapt it to the cultures they're working with, whether outside the US or here. We're so diverse now, right? And then the third piece was a place to collect and share the stories that the students and teachers in Belize had written, to give them that, look at, this is my work in print. And that's how the book finally came to be. And it took a while. The project really ended in January 2012, and I started in 2005. And then the book took several years, and it just was officially released January of this year.
Wow.
So it was quite a process.
Yes, quite a process. And also, as you say, that you don't have to be the super expert on it. That I know in all of your storytelling, you really try to emphasize the call to action as well, and you can see that process in the stories in Belize, and then you moved on to the Kenyan project as well. I mean, I know there's always lots of things interacting in your life, and you've said that you've gotten inspiration from so many people, and so many things have been a matter of circumstances and the right person being at the right time in the right place. But in Kenya, you did some similar things, but you also took it to a different level too, I think. So do you want to talk about that? And that beautiful, beautiful cover of this book, and artist who created it. It's just spectacular.
Stephen Kienza, who has an incredible story himself too. So the Kenya project, the reason for going to Kenya was I auditioned for a storytelling festival, and I got accepted into it, and that was a wonderful gift. But I wanted to stay longer than the 10 days of the festival, so I planned an entire month. And it was, you mentioned these happenstance meetings. In a nutshell, I had met a woman on the New York City subway. We had chatted 5 years prior, and I finally emailed her and said, hey, I don't know if you remember me, but I'm going to be in Kenya. I know you've been doing some really great work in Uganda. They're right next door. I'd love to take your project to Kenya. Now, it was a bit different. She was focusing on people dancing and painting their stories. For me, I really wanted to collect stories that showed developing countries in a different light. So often we focus on poverty, we focus on pity, we're focusing on civil war and HIV, AIDS, and those are all very real things, but there's so much more going on. There's so much innovation that's happening, and I firmly believe there's a lot we can learn. So much we can learn if we're engaging in conversation that's more like this and less like this. And so it was about interviewing, and in Kenya it was interviewing people who had Kenyans who had started projects that were really serving their communities. So one of them, and the artist who did the book cover, he is with Uweza, which is in Kibera, one of the largest slums in Eastern Africa. And what I saw there was, yes, there was poverty, but oh my gosh, there was so much more creativity, drumming, incredible music coming out of the slums. In fact, many people choose to actually stay there because of the vibrancy of what's going on beyond the poverty, right? And I also interviewed women in Ndiwa, Kenya, which is a farming village. And in the past, the tradition was if a woman's husband would die, she would be inherited by another male family member. And he's supposed to take care of her, but often that's not really what happened. Or they would really be shunned by the rest of the community because they chose not to do that tradition.
Right, and that's a beautiful photograph that you have of the women. It's just...
The women, yeah, and that was so, that came about after having a fantastic opportunity to sit with them and hear their stories of their experience. But it was a process in creating the space for that to happen.
Right, and creating trust.
Yes, yes, very much so. And Jared O'Kenny is the man who started this farming cooperative. It's through SEPASET, which is his program. And 72 women started, 66 are still in it, several years on. And they'd never shared their life experience, what they had been through, because it's not part of their culture. You just kind of grin and bear it, really. But once that gate was opened and the trust was established, and part of that was by me sharing a bit of my own story. The first thing I asked them was, when you see me, when you see my skin color, when you see me, what kinds of things come to your mind? And so they would share what they thought my life was like. And then I said, well, actually, I started working when I was 12 because I had to. My father had multiple suicide attempts and was quite sick. And so this was a bit of my life. Well, them hearing that opened their heart to say, oh, this is some of our experience.
And it is hard to go across culture, as you said, of all the norms of
the assumptions, that can be made,
and not telling, and the storytelling has that power, and I think part of that power is in you, in the sense that you are creating these bridges, and the your dynamism, obviously, but the I think your belief in story is what comes through, and I think that that's something that people across cultures understand. I mean, it's language, it's culture, it's barriers, it's norms, and so forth. But they understand that passion, and I think they understand the belief in the power. And I know, you call it cause-focused storytelling, and what you do is very different, I think, from, as I said, sort of the once upon a time, that you always feel that there's action behind this. There's a goal that you're going to, and I know you're going to be going to Nepal to continue your work. but do you want to just quickly, before we go to your actually doing storytelling, the Ghana project?
Sure. So that was another labor of love.
Yeah.
So with this one, going to Ghana came out of the Belize project. I got a call on Skype from Tofik, a librarian in Accra. And I thought it was a joke at first. I really, is this really? And he panned and showed me the library, so it was real. And he said,
technology
can you, right? Isn't it incredible? And he said, you know, I really think your project connecting the cultural stories in Belize, the way you did that, could you do that here in Ghana? And I said, yes. I don't know exactly how or exactly when, but the answer is yes. So it took 2 years to get there. And then the project was quite different. It started out with working with librarians in 6 different libraries throughout Accra and training. And some of the libraries are massive. I mean, the staffs are like 50 people. It's not, you know, they're not all these small village libraries. Right. And it was started by a woman, Kathy Knowles, who I had connected to in Belize. So it's this interesting intersection of, you know, all of these things coming together. And then in Ghana, the difference was that in Kenya, I interviewed people who had started organizations. In Ghana, it was very much interviewing individuals from all different walks of life. And the idea was, if you could tell people about your country, what would you want them to know? Beyond the pity, poverty, beyond corruption, what do you want people to know? And so it was, Ghana is, how would you finish that sentence? And then it became very poetic for many of them, and sharing. The one really quick story is I met a PhD physics candidate who had to build his own equipment to do his experiments. He was told he'd have to go to another university to finish. And he said, no, I found plans on the internet. And he got design students to build what he needed and then taught other students how to use it. So again, that perseverance, that finding another way to do something. And I think we can learn.
We can learn. We can. And I just want to give a quote from Alice Walker, who said, you know, look closely at the present you are constructing, and it should look like the future you are dreaming. And I think that's what you've done in each of these countries. And I know that you have a story that you would like to tell about the soldier in Iran. And we're going to end with that. We're going to go to Black, and I want to thank you for coming. This time just went by in a split second, but we will turn to you and your story. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. I wanted to share with you the most powerful moment I've ever experienced in story. It was the last day of the Storytelling Festival in Iran, and we had just experienced this huge celebration with trophies and speeches by all these dignitaries, probably 800 people in the audience. And up on the stage, we were surrounded by children and people congratulating us, people hugging us. And that's when I noticed him. He was about halfway back in the auditorium, and he was dressed in camouflage, wearing a burgundy beret. And I noticed that he was looking right at me. I mean, he was making direct eye contact with me, and he was waving something back and forth in the air. And I couldn't tell if he was excited or agitated. All I knew in that moment was it had something to do with me. And before I knew it, he was out of his seat and he was marching purposefully directly toward me. And he was still waving something back and forth in the air, and I still couldn't read his expression. Was it excited? Was it agitated? And then I had a moment of panic. And I worked back in my mind through the prior days, and I'm thinking to myself, did I inadvertently do something that was causing an international incident that I was unaware of? And I'm thinking about when we were in the restaurant and we'd all been joking around together. Maybe someone heard that and they were offended by it. Or maybe it was that night when we were dancing in the van. And in Iran, there's no public dancing. And so my panic has now turned into just about terror, because there's no diplomatic relationship between our country. And I think I could be in really big trouble. So then I do something I'm really not proud of. I grab a hold of Lillian. She's the storyteller from Australia and much taller than I am. And I grabbed her and sort of used her as a human shield. And then he's at the edge of the stage and he's still looking at me. and I see what's in his hand. It's a cell phone. And then I can hear the words that he's saying. America, America, I love your story. Photo? All he wanted was a photograph. And in that moment, I started to cry. Miriam, my translator, pulled me aside and she said, Kristin, why are you crying? This is a beautiful moment. And I said, that's exactly why I'm crying. This is incredible. I mean, this is an Iranian male soldier, and he wants to take a photo with me, an American female storyteller. If he could walk across that bridge, who are we not to? I smiled and I saw him gesturing someone else to come up on stage, and it must have been his daughter. She was maybe 7 or 8, and we took a photo together, and then he was gesturing for someone else to come up. I believe it was his wife, and we took a photo. And then finally he touched his heart and he said, now me. And standing next to me, I have to tell you, it was the hardest not hugging I had ever done in my life. We stood as closely as possible without actually touching. And that photograph was captured. I treasure it because for me, without a doubt, that was the power of story, to connect across 2 seemingly different cultures and connect heart to heart in humanity. I hope you connect heart to heart in humanity too. Thanks.
Well, that was a great story, and thank you. I know you have 1,000 stories, and trying to pick one. You did mention about it was one of the times that you really had to control yourself not to give a hug. Do you want to say just a quick thing about your free hugs?
Sure. So this is something else I never leave home without. It's my free hug sign. This is a fancy one that was made for me by a colleague at the World Bank. They're not usually this fabulous. And this started for me in New York City, 2008, really when the financial crisis was going on, and had been invited to share them in Union Square, and right from that moment was hooked. And there was a reason why. When we hug, we release a neurochemical, and it's called oxytocin, and it literally makes us feel good from the inside out. And what I learned really quickly is through touch, there's trust that's established very quickly. It was a gateway to story. It was a gateway for people to be able to share things that were happening in their lives that often were really challenging. In a city like New York, even though there's 8.5 million people, it can be really lonely.
It can
so
be
it's connection.
Lonely. And you have also worked with mental health issues, and you have a reminder.
I do. I don't know if anyone's heard of the semicolon project, but for me, my semicolon is, it says enough. And it's a reminder for me as a recovering overachiever that I am enough exactly as I am. You are enough exactly as you are. And chances are we're probably doing enough. So it's a reminder to stop and pause and breathe and know that we're enough exactly right now.
As we are.
Yes. And
you mentioned also, just in passing, the World Bank. What are you doing with them now on storytelling?
I love it. I am teaching presentation skills, so it's really about serving them to tell the stories behind the data, really focusing on the human beings that they are impacting with the projects that they're doing, with the initiatives across the globe. And so we use TED Talks style model because I've done some TED work and TEDx work.
People can go to TED Talk and TED.com and see
some of the work.
Yes.
And that's a whole other story for another time. And they're enamored by the TED model, and it is a strong model because it utilizes story and it utilizes a very strong key message delivered concisely and quickly.
And always dynamically.
Yes, exactly.
You're not really just kind of standing there off in the
You're
engaging the audience, which is of course what storytelling does. So what kind of feedback have you gotten from staffers of a sense of?
Oh, it's been amazing actually. Several things. One that Two that actually really touched me. One was there had been a group that had been trying for 3 years to build a public-private partnership in one of the countries served, and they couldn't come to yes. And then after using story and having a really clear message that was communicated beyond data, they finally got to yes. So that was from sort of a factual, that was really wonderful. And then this February, I was asked to coach staff who were presenting to the World Bank president. And it was such an honor to be asked. And then afterwards, to have Phil, who had asked me, tell both my bosses that, you know, the coaching, coming to those stories and such crystal clear messages, that Jim Kim, the president, really got the messages. And for me, that just felt like more than $1 million, knowing that the validation of the work.
And also, you can do so much good work, but if you can't somehow convey it, that what you've done and what the people have done for you. Now, I know that you don't leave home without the free hug sign, but you also don't leave home without bubbles.
Yes. We should do this right now.
Yes, in case we run out of time.
So bubbles are a magical way to connect again and open up conversation. And that's why I carry them.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you for bubbles and stories. Thank you very much, Kristin. This is On the Go with AAUW. Thank you for watching.